The morning mist clung to the Blue Ridge Mountains like a shroud as Sarah and Brennan shouldered their backpacks at the Harpers Ferry trailhead on June 15, 1988. Sarah, 26, adjusted the straps of her forest green pack one final time, her auburn hair catching the early sunlight that filtered through the canopy above. Michael, 28, checked his compass and studied the trail map with the methodical precision that had made him such a reliable geology professor at Virginia Tech. They had planned this section hike for months, a week-long journey through some of the most beautiful terrain the Appalachian Trail had to offer, from West Virginia into Virginia's Shenandoah National Park. "Ready for our adventure, Mrs. Brennan?" Michael asked, using the formal address that always made Sarah smile. They had been married just 18 months, and he still found excuses to say her new name aloud. Sarah grinned and adjusted her baseball cap, a faded Richmond Spiders memento from her college days. "Lead the way, Professor." She had taken a week off from her job as a research librarian at the University of Virginia, and this trip represented more than just a hiking vacation. After months of 12-hour days and weekend work, they both desperately needed time away from their demanding careers to reconnect with each other and the natural world they both loved. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Now let's continue with Sarah and Michael's journey into the mountains. The first day unfolded exactly as they had hoped. They made good time along the well-maintained trail, stopping frequently to identify wild flowers, Sarah's specialty, and geological formations that caught Michael's professional eye. They encountered other hikers throughout the day. A retired couple from Maryland, 2 college students from James Madison University, and a lone thru-hiker who went by the trail name Compass Rose. Everyone they met was friendly and helpful, sharing information about trail conditions ahead and recommendations for the best campsites. That evening, they pitched their tent at the Blackburn Trail Center, an old stone house that served as a hostel for hikers. The facility was nearly full, creating a festive atmosphere as hikers shared stories around a crackling fire. Sarah pulled out her leather-bound journal, a wedding gift from her sister, and began documenting their first day. She wrote about the cardinal they had seen drinking from a stream, the way the light fell through the trees at midday, and Michael's excitement when he found what he believed to be a piece of quartzite with interesting mineral inclusions. "What are you writing about me?" Michael asked, settling beside her on a log they had claimed as their seat. "How you nearly fell into Antietam Creek trying to get a better look at that rock formation," Sarah teased, not looking up from her careful cursive. "It was perfectly balanced," Michael protested, "and that wasn't quartzite. It was definitely metamorphic schist with mica inclusions." Sarah laughed and leaned against his shoulder. "I'll make sure to correct the geological record." The second day brought them deeper into the Virginia mountains, where the trail became more challenging and the crowds thinned considerably. They hiked through dense forests of oak and hickory, occasionally emerging onto ridgelines that offered breathtaking views of the Shenandoah Valley spread out below them like a green carpet dotted with farms and small towns. Michael pointed out Luray to the east and Strasburg to the north, using landmarks he recognized from his geological surveys of the region. Around noon, they stopped for lunch at a small clearing beside a mountain stream. Sarah spread their map on a flat rock and traced their progress with her finger. They were making excellent time. Perhaps too good, she thought. Michael had a tendency to push himself harder than necessary, driven by the same perfectionism that made him such a respected professor, but sometimes made him a demanding hiking partner. "Maybe we should take the afternoon easier," Sarah suggested, unwrapping the peanut butter sandwiches she had prepared that morning. "We're ahead of schedule, and this spot is so beautiful." Michael studied the map thoughtfully. There's a shelter about 6 miles ahead, Manassas Gap. If we push on, we could make it by evening and have a covered place to sleep in case it rains." He looked up at the sky, where high cirrus clouds had begun to appear. Weather forecast called for possible storms later in the week. Sarah nodded, trusting his judgment. Michael had been hiking these mountains since his undergraduate days at VPI, and his knowledge of local weather patterns was usually reliable. They packed up their lunch and continued south along the trail, which began to climb more steeply as they approached the gap. The afternoon proved more difficult than expected. The trail, which had been clearly marked and well maintained for their first day and a half, began to show signs of recent storm damage. Several large trees had fallen across the path, forcing them to climb over or detour around the obstacles. In one area, what appeared to be a washout from heavy rains had obliterated a section of trail entirely, leaving only a few faded white blazes on distant trees to indicate the correct route. "This doesn't match what the guidebook described," Michael said, consulting their copy of the Appalachian Trail guide. "According to this, we should have passed a road crossing 2 miles back." Sarah looked around at the dense forest that surrounded them. The trees were taller here, their canopy so thick that little sunlight reached the forest floor. The understory was dense with mountain laurel and rhododendron, creating a maze of green that seemed to close in around them as they tried to determine their location. "Maybe we missed the crossing," Sarah suggested. "Should we backtrack?" Michael checked his compass and studied their topographic map. "The trail should be heading southwest here, but this path seems to be going more southeast." He looked back the way they had come, but the forest already seemed to have swallowed their route. "Let's continue forward for another half-mile. If we don't see familiar landmarks, we'll turn back." But the half-mile stretched into a mile, then 2, as the path they were following, if it could even be called a path, wound deeper into the wilderness. The afternoon light began to fade earlier than expected under the thick canopy, and Sarah realized with growing concern that they had not seen another hiker since late morning. "Michael," she said, trying to keep the worry out of her voice, "I think we need to admit we're lost." He stopped and turned to face her, his expression troubled. Michael prided himself on his outdoor skills and had never been seriously lost in 20 years of hiking. "You're right," he said finally. "But we can't be too far off the main trail. The AT doesn't just disappear." They decided to make camp where they were and try to sort out their location in the morning when they would have better light and clearer heads. Michael found a relatively flat spot among the trees, and they set up their tent as darkness fell around them. The forest that had seemed merely dense during the day now felt oppressive and alien. The familiar sounds of civilization, distant traffic, aircraft, even other hikers, were completely absent, replaced by the whisper of wind through leaves and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the darkness beyond their small circle of flashlight. Sarah wrote in her journal by the light of their camp lantern, while Michael pored over maps and guidebooks, trying to determine where they might have gone wrong. "Day 2 ended differently than planned," she wrote. "We seem to have gotten off the main trail somehow. Michael is worried, though he's trying not to show it. The forest feels different here, older, wilder. I keep thinking I hear voices in the distance, but when I listen carefully, there's nothing but wind." She paused, listening to the night sounds around them. Somewhere far off, she thought she heard the sound of laughter, faint and brief, like hikers at a distant campsite. But when she mentioned it to Michael, he just shook his head. "Sound carries strangely in the mountains," he said. "What you heard could be miles away, or it could be an owl. Try to get some sleep. We'll figure this out in the morning." But Sarah found sleep elusive that night. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified and somehow threatening. Several times she was sure she heard footsteps circling their campsite, but when she whispered to Michael, he was already awake, listening intently to the darkness beyond their tent walls. "Probably just deer," he whispered back, but his hand found hers in the darkness and held tight. Dawn came grey and misty, with a light rain pattering against their tent. They packed quickly and tried to retrace their route from the previous afternoon, but in the morning light, the forest looked completely different. Landmarks they thought they remembered were nowhere to be found, and the path they had followed seemed to have vanished entirely, as if the forest had reclaimed it overnight. "This is impossible," Michael said, standing in what appeared to be a small clearing. "Trails don't just disappear." Sarah pulled out her journal and wrote a quick entry. "Day 3, still lost. Michael says this is impossible, but here we are. The forest seems to be playing tricks on us. Paths that were clear yesterday are gone today, starting to get really scared." They spent the entire day trying to find their way back to the Appalachian Trail, but every direction they tried seemed to lead them deeper into the wilderness. The rain continued intermittently, making the forest floor slippery and treacherous. By evening, they were exhausted, soaked, and no closer to civilization than they had been that morning. That night, Sarah wrote the longest entry yet in her journal, documenting their growing desperation and the strange phenomena they had begun to notice. The forest seemed to shift around them, paths appearing and disappearing, landmarks moving or changing when they weren't looking directly at them. Most disturbing of all were the sounds. Voices calling from the darkness, laughter that seemed to come from no particular direction, and once, unmistakably, the sound of someone singing an old folk song somewhere in the distance. "Michael thinks I'm imagining things," she wrote, "but I know what I heard. There are other people in these woods, but we can never find them, no matter how hard we try to follow the sounds. It's as if they're always just out of reach, like they're in a different forest entirely." As the days passed, their situation grew increasingly desperate. Their food supplies, planned for a week-long hike, began to run low. Michael rationed their remaining provisions carefully, but they both knew they couldn't survive much longer without finding their way back to the trail or encountering other hikers who could help them. Sarah's journal entries became shorter and more frantic. Day 6. "Food almost gone. Michael won't admit it, but I think we're going to die out here. Found what looked like a trail marker today, but when we got closer, it was just scratches on a tree bark. Or were they? Nothing makes sense anymore." On the 7th day, they found the cabin. It appeared suddenly in a small clearing, as if it had materialized from the morning mist. The structure was old, but solid, built from hewn logs with a stone chimney and a front porch that sagged slightly under the weight of years. Moss covered parts of the roof, and the windows were dark, but the building appeared to be in good condition. "Thank God," Michael whispered. "Someone lives here. They can help us get back to the trail." But as they approached the cabin, Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. There were no signs of recent habitation, no car, no cleared garden, no equipment or tools that would indicate current use. The structure felt empty, abandoned, as if it had been waiting in the forest for decades. Michael knocked on the front door, calling out, "Hello, is anyone home?" When there was no response, he tried the door handle. It turned easily, and the door swung open with a long, mournful creak. Inside, the cabin was neat and clean, as if someone had just stepped out for a moment. There was a stone fireplace with wood already laid, a simple kitchen with hand-pumped water that still worked, and a bedroom with a bed made up with fresh linens. Most remarkably, there were supplies, canned goods, dry goods, even a few articles of clothing that looked roughly their size. "This is too convenient," Sarah said, voicing what they both were thinking. "It's like someone was expecting us." But their desperation overrode their caution. They were exhausted, hungry, and still completely lost. The cabin offered shelter and supplies they desperately needed. Whatever the explanation for its convenient appearance, they decided to stay until they could figure out their next move. That evening, as they sat by a fire Michael had built in the fireplace, Sarah made her longest journal entry since their ordeal began. She wrote about the strange perfection of the cabin, the way it seemed designed specifically for their needs, and her growing suspicion that their situation was more than just a case of getting lost in the woods. "Michael found a radio today," she wrote, "but it only picks up static. He says that's normal in the mountains, but I tried it at different times and different locations around the cabin. Always the same static, never any voices or music. It's as if the outside world has ceased to exist." She paused in her writing, listening to the night sounds beyond the cabin walls. The forest was quiet tonight, quieter than it had been since they left the main trail. Even the usual whisper of wind through the trees was absent. "I keep thinking about that folk song I heard on our second night," she continued writing. "I've been trying to remember the words, but they seem to slip away every time I think I have them. Michael says I'm getting obsessed with things that don't matter, but I think they do matter. I think everything that's happened to us matters in ways we don't understand yet." The next few days passed in a strange routine. They explored the area around the cabin during the day, always hoping to find a path back to civilization, but always returning empty-handed as the forest seemed to guide them in circles. The cabin continued to provide for their needs in ways that defied explanation. The pantry never seemed to empty completely, the water pump always worked, and the fireplace drew perfectly despite the fact that they never cleaned the chimney. Sarah's journal entries during this period revealed her growing awareness that something fundamental had changed in their reality. "Day 12, I think, it's getting hard to keep track," she wrote. "Found a calendar in the cabin today. It was turned to June 1988, which should be the current month, but all the pages after June 20th have been torn out. We left for our hike on June 15th. Are we still in the same month? The same year? Time feels different here, like it's moving sideways instead of forward." Michael, meanwhile, had become obsessed with his maps and compass, trying to plot their location and find a route back to the known world. But the instruments seemed to give different readings each time he consulted them, as if magnetic north itself was shifting around them. "Michael measured the same distance between two trees 5 times today," Sarah wrote. "Each time he got a different result. When I pointed this out, he got angry and said I was undermining his confidence, but I think confidence in the normal rules of reality might not be helpful here." On what Sarah calculated was their 15th day at the cabin, they made a discovery that changed everything. While exploring what they had thought was the storage area under the front porch, Michael found a wooden chest buried beneath several inches of pine needles and forest debris. Inside the chest were dozens of journals, each similar to the one Sarah had been keeping, and each documenting the experiences of previous visitors to the cabin. The earliest entry they found was dated 1952, written by a man named Robert Whitmore, who described getting lost while hunting deer in the area. His handwriting was shaky, and his later entries spoke of the same phenomena they had experienced: the shifting forest, the elusive sounds of other people, the cabin that provided for all needs while keeping its visitors trapped in an endless loop of days that felt like the same day repeated. "Found others like us," Sarah wrote that night. "So many others. The journals go back decades. Some people stayed here for weeks, others for months. The most recent entry before ours was from 1985, a woman named Helen Morrison, who came here with her husband while they were hiking the AT. She wrote about the same things we've experienced. The last entry in her journal just says, 'We understand now. We're going to try to go home.' That was 3 years ago." Sarah turned the page in Helen Morrison's journal and found it blank. The rest of the journal was empty, as if Helen and her husband had simply vanished in the middle of their story. Over the following days, Sarah and Michael read through dozens of the journals, piecing together the experiences of the previous visitors to the cabin. A pattern emerged from the accounts. People would arrive lost and desperate, find the cabin perfectly suited to their needs, and then become trapped in a loop of time that prevented them from aging or leaving, but also prevented them from truly living. Some of the journal writers had theories about what was happening to them. A geologist from the 1960s believed they had stumbled into some kind of temporal anomaly. A physicist from the 1970s wrote extensively about parallel dimensions and the possibility that the cabin existed in a space between realities. A folklorist from the early 1980s documented local legends about the area, including stories of hikers who disappeared for decades only to return unchanged, claiming they had been away for only a few days. But regardless of their theories, all the journal writers faced the same fundamental problem. They couldn't leave. The forest would not permit it. Every attempt to find a way back to the normal world resulted in them walking in circles until they found themselves back at the cabin, usually carrying exactly the same supplies they had started with, as if their journey had been undone. "We've been here 3 weeks now," Sarah wrote. "Or maybe it's been 3 years or 3 days. Time doesn't work the same way here. Michael has started talking about accepting our situation, making the best of it. But I can't accept it. There has to be a way out. The people who wrote these other journals, they all gave up eventually. They stopped looking for an exit and started treating this place like home. I won't do that." Her determination to escape became the driving force of their remaining time at the cabin, while Michael gradually settled into the routine of their strange new existence. Sarah spent hours each day walking the perimeter of their prison, looking for weaknesses in whatever force kept them trapped. She mapped every tree, every rock, every stream within what she estimated was a 2-mile radius of the cabin. She tested different routes at different times of day, tried following animal tracks, and even attempted to climb the tallest trees to get a better view of the surrounding area. Nothing worked. The forest was beautiful and peaceful, but it was also inexorable. No matter which direction she walked or how carefully she navigated, she always found herself back at the cabin as evening approached, often without remembering exactly how she had gotten there. Michael worried about her increasingly frantic attempts to escape. "Maybe we should accept this," he said one evening as they sat by the fire. "We have food, shelter, each other. There are worse fates." Sarah looked at him with something close to fury. "This isn't living, Michael. This is just existing. We're like exhibits in some kind of museum, preserved but not alive." That night, she made what would be her final journal entry. "Day unknown. Michael is giving up. He wants to accept this place, make it our home. But I can't do that. I won't do that. Tomorrow I'm going to try something different. If I don't come back, if something happens to me, I want whoever reads this to know that we tried. We tried to get home." The next morning, Sarah set out on what she intended to be her final attempt to escape the forest. But this time, instead of trying to find a way out, she decided to go deeper in. Her theory, developed from reading the other journals, was that the cabin and its surrounding area existed in some kind of bubble of altered reality. If that was true, then perhaps by going far enough in the opposite direction, away from where they thought civilization should be, she might find the other side of the bubble. Michael begged her not to go, but Sarah was determined. She packed light, taking only water and a small amount of food, and set out early in the morning while the mist still clung to the trees. For the first time since their ordeal began, the forest didn't seem to resist her movements. She walked for hours without encountering the usual subtle redirections that had always guided her back toward the cabin. The trees grew taller and older as she progressed, and the forest floor became carpeted with moss so thick it absorbed the sound of her footsteps. By afternoon, She began to encounter things she had never seen before in their weeks at the cabin, strange rock formations that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, clearings where the grass grew in perfect geometric patterns, and streams that flowed uphill in defiance of gravity. As evening approached, instead of finding herself back at the cabin as always happened, Sarah found herself at the edge of a vast meadow she had never seen before. In the center of the meadow stood a single massive oak tree, its trunk so wide that a dozen people holding hands couldn't encircle it. As she approached the tree, she saw that its bark was covered with carved initials and names, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, going back decades or perhaps centuries. Among the carvings, she found the names of people whose journals she had read at the cabin. Robert Whitmore, 1952, Helen and Tom Morrison, 1985. And carved higher than the rest, in letters that seemed to glow with their own light, "The way home requires letting go of the way back." Sarah understood then what had happened to all the previous visitors to the cabin, and what choice she now faced. She could return to Michael and the safety of their temporal prison, or she could step forward into whatever lay beyond the great oak tree. She thought of Michael, probably frantic with worry by now, and of the life they had planned together back in the normal world. But she also thought of the empty pages in Helen Morrison's journal and the peaceful acceptance she had seen in the later entries of so many of the previous visitors. She carved her own name below the others. Sarah Brennan, 1988, still searching for home. Or then she walked around to the far side of the massive tree and found what she somehow knew would be there. A doorway formed by the tree's roots, leading down into the earth and toward a soft, welcoming light. Without looking back toward the cabin and the man she loved but could no longer save, Sarah stepped through the doorway and into whatever lay beyond. Back at the cabin, Michael waited through the night and into the next day for Sarah's return. When she didn't come back, he set out to search for her, following the same paths through the forest he had walked dozens of times before. But this time, instead of the familiar routine of walking in circles until he found himself back where he started, he discovered something new. Sarah's journal, lying open beneath the great oak tree in a meadow he had never seen before. The journal ended with her final entry, but on the page after her last words, in handwriting that looked like hers but somehow different, more confident, more at peace, was a single sentence. "I found the way home. It's not where we thought it would be." Michael spent the next several days, or weeks, or months. Time had become meaningless, reading and rereading Sarah's journal, trying to understand what had happened to her and what choice he now faced. The forest seemed to be waiting for his decision, patient and implacable as always. Eventually, he returned to the cabin and added Sarah's journal to the wooden chest with all the others. Then he sat down and began to write his own final entry in a small notebook he found among the cabin's supplies. Sarah was braver than I was. She chose to keep searching even when searching became impossible. I don't know if she found what she was looking for, but I know she found something. I'm going to try to follow her path, but I need more time to prepare. If someone finds this journal and the others in the chest, know that we were here, we were real, and we never stopped looking for the way home. The cabin will take care of you as long as you need it to, but don't let it become your home. There's something beyond this place, something Sarah found. I'm going to find it too. But Michael never wrote another entry. Like so many of the previous visitors to the cabin, he found the comfort of routine and the safety of the known too compelling to abandon. Days passed into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years that felt like a single, unchanging day. He maintained the cabin, read the journals of previous visitors, and sometimes thought he heard Sarah's laughter in the wind through the trees. He aged slowly in that place, if he aged at all, and eventually he stopped counting the days entirely. Sometimes hikers would stumble into the clearing where the cabin sat, lost and desperate, just as he and Sarah had been so many years before. He would share the cabin's supplies with them, tell them about the chest of journals, and watch as they either found the courage to search for something beyond the forest's boundaries or settled into the same routine that had claimed him. The cabin endured, patient and welcoming, a way station for lost souls who had wandered too far from the marked trails of the normal world. In the wooden chest beneath the front porch, the journals accumulated, dozens, then hundreds, each documenting the same story of people who had found more than they were looking for and less than they needed. And somewhere beyond the great oak tree, in a place that might have been home, or might have been something else entirely, Sarah's story continued in ways that couldn't be written in any journal that existed in the world of marked trails and mapped territories. 20 years passed in the outside world before anyone found evidence of what had happened to Sarah and Michael Brennan. In June 2008, exactly 20 years after their disappearance, a team of forestry workers conducting a survey in a remote section of the Virginia mountains discovered what appeared to be the remains of an old homestead. Among the ruins, they found a wooden chest containing dozens of journals and notebooks, including a leather-bound book with Sarah Brennan's name embossed on the cover. The discovery made national news, not because of the Brennans, who had been presumed dead for 2 decades, but because of the implications of what the journals contained. The earliest entries dated back to the 1950s, and all of them told variations of the same impossible story. Hikers who had become lost, found a mysterious cabin, and then experienced some kind of temporal displacement that prevented them from returning to the normal world. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a folklorist at the University of Virginia who had known Sarah professionally, was asked to examine the journals and provide an expert opinion on their contents. What she found was a meticulously documented collection of accounts that defied rational explanation, but showed an internal consistency that suggested something more than elaborate fiction. The level of detail in these journals is extraordinary, Dr. Warren wrote in her preliminary report. The writers document the same phenomena from different perspectives across multiple decades. The handwriting analysis confirms that each journal was written by a different person, and the paper and ink types are consistent with the time periods indicated by the dates. Most significantly, several of the writers can be verified as real people who disappeared while hiking in this area. The investigation that followed confirmed that at least 15 of the journal writers could be matched with missing persons reports filed over the past 60 years. In every case, the individuals had been experienced hikers who disappeared while walking sections of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia or West Virginia. Search and rescue efforts had failed to find any trace of them, and the cases had eventually been closed as unsolved disappearances. Sarah and Michael Brennan were among those verified cases. In 1988, they had been reported missing after failing to meet Michael's brother at a planned rendezvous point in Shenandoah National Park. A massive search effort involving multiple agencies had found no trace of them, and they were eventually presumed to have died in an accident somewhere in the wilderness. But Sarah's journal told a different story, one that aligned closely with the accounts found in the other notebooks. Her final entries described the discovery of the other journals and her decision to search for a way out of what she termed the bubble of altered reality that held them captive. The forestry workers who found the chest reported that the area where they discovered it had unusual characteristics. Magnetic compasses didn't work reliably in the vicinity, GPS devices showed conflicting readings, and several team members reported experiencing disorientation and time distortion while working in the area. Most strangely, aerial photographs of the region showed no signs of the cabin or other structures that were described in such detail in the journals. Dr. Warren spent months analyzing the contents of the journals, looking for patterns and connections that might explain what had happened to the missing hikers. What she found was a consistent narrative of people who had somehow stepped outside the normal flow of time and space, finding themselves in a place that provided for their physical needs while trapping them in an endless loop of days that never progressed toward any meaningful future. The most compelling aspect of these accounts, she wrote, is not the supernatural elements, which could be dismissed as fiction or delusion, but the psychological accuracy of the writers' responses to their situation. These read like genuine accounts of people grappling with an impossible reality, not like stories invented for entertainment or attention. The final mystery was what had happened to the writers themselves. None of their remains had been found in the area where the journals were discovered, and there was no evidence of a cabin or other permanent structures. It was as if the people who had written the journals had simply vanished, leaving behind only their words as proof they had ever existed. Sarah's journal ended with her description of finding the great oak tree and her decision to walk through the doorway formed by its roots. Michael's final entry spoke of his intention to follow her path, but his need for more time to prepare. After that, his journal was empty, as if he had stopped writing mid-story. Dr. Warren's final report concluded that the journals represented either an elaborate hoax spanning multiple decades and involving dozens of participants, or evidence of something that challenged conventional understanding of reality itself. Given the verifiable disappearances of the journal writers and the internal consistency of their accounts, she leaned toward the latter explanation, though she acknowledged that such a conclusion raised more questions than it answered. The story of the discovered journals sparked intense interest from paranormal investigators, folklorists, and skeptics alike. Multiple expeditions were organized to search for the mysterious cabin or other evidence that might corroborate the accounts, but none succeeded in finding anything beyond the usual challenges of wilderness hiking. The area where the journals were discovered was eventually designated as a special research zone, with access restricted to scientific expeditions approved by the National Park Service. Dr. Warren led several of these expeditions, using sophisticated equipment to measure electromagnetic fields, gravitational anomalies, and other phenomena that might explain the reported disappearances. On her third expedition to the site, in October 2010, Dr. Warren had an experience that changed her perspective on the entire case. While conducting measurements near the location where the journals had been found, she became separated from her team during a sudden fog bank that seemed to appear from nowhere. For what she estimated was about an hour, she wandered through a forest that seemed subtly different from the one she'd been studying. The trees were taller, the undergrowth thicker, and the quality of light had an otherworldly luminescence. During this hour, she reported seeing a structure in the distance that looked like a log cabin, though when she tried to approach it, it seemed to recede before her, no matter which direction she walked. She also heard voices calling her name, though no members of her team were in the immediate area and her radio wasn't working. When the fog lifted, Dr. Warren found herself back at the expedition's base camp, with her team frantically searching for her. According to their accounts, she had been missing for less than 10 minutes, though her watch indicated that over an hour had passed. Most disturbing of all, her scientific equipment showed readings during her disappearance that were unlike anything she had ever recorded. Electromagnetic signatures that suggested the presence of massive energy sources with no identifiable origin. That experience convinced Dr. Warren that the journals contained authentic accounts of something that defied normal explanation. In her subsequent papers on the case, she proposed that the area contained what she termed a persistent temporal anomaly, a location where the normal rules of space and time operated differently, creating conditions that could trap unwary travelers in a loop of displaced reality. Her work attracted criticism from mainstream academics, who argued that she had been influenced by suggestion and was seeing patterns where none existed. But it also attracted attention from other researchers who had encountered similar anomalies in different locations around the world. Slowly, a picture emerged of multiple sites where people had reported experiences similar to those described in the Virginia journals. The case of Sarah and Michael Brennan became a touchstone for this research, not because their story was unique, but because Sarah's detailed documentation provided the most complete account of what it might be like to become trapped in such an anomaly. Her journal offered a window into the psychological and emotional journey of someone trying to maintain their humanity while confronting the breakdown of everything they understood about reality. In her final published paper on the case, Dr. Warren wrote, "Sarah Brennan's journal suggests that these anomalies are not simply natural phenomena, but something more complex. Places where the boundary between the known and unknown becomes permeable, where people must choose between the safety of an eternal present and the risk of stepping into an uncertain future." Her decision to walk through the doorway in the great oak tree represents perhaps the most courageous act documented in any of the journals, the choice to embrace mystery rather than accept confinement. The journals remain in the archives of the University of Virginia, available to researchers but protected from public access to prevent them from becoming the focus of tourism or sensationalism. Occasionally, new expeditions are approved to study the area where they were found, but no additional evidence has been discovered. The Appalachian Trail continues to attract millions of hikers each year, and most complete their journeys safely and without incident. But occasionally, experienced hikers still disappear in remote areas without leaving any trace, their fates unknown and their stories untold. Search and rescue teams have learned to be alert for certain warning signs in these cases. Reports of trails that seem to shift or disappear, compass readings that change without explanation, and the sound of voices calling from empty forests. When these elements appear in a missing person case, the searches are conducted differently, with special attention paid to areas that show unusual electromagnetic or gravitational characteristics. Sometimes, years later, evidence is found. A backpack hung carefully on a tree branch, a tent pitched in a clearing with no footprints leading to or from it, or a journal left open to pages that document experiences eerily similar to those described by Sarah and Michael Brennan. The official position of the National Park Service is that these disappearances are the result of natural hazards and human error, explicable within the normal parameters of wilderness safety. But among the search and rescue teams, rangers, and long-time hikers who know the mountains best, there is an unspoken understanding that some places in the wilderness operate by different rules than the ones taught in survival manuals. Sarah Brennan's journal ends with her decision to step through the doorway beneath the great oak tree, leaving behind the world she knew in search of something she couldn't name but recognized as necessary. Whether she found what she was looking for, or whether she simply traded one form of captivity for another, remains unknown. But her words continue to resonate with anyone who has felt the pull of the unknown, the desire to step off the marked trail and discover what lies beyond the boundaries of the mapped world. In choosing to search for home rather than accept exile, she embodied a fundamental human impulse that no amount of rational explanation can fully contain. Michael's story, by contrast, illustrates the equally human tendency to seek safety in routine and familiarity, even when that safety comes at the cost of freedom. His final journal entry suggests that he understood what Sarah had chosen and intended to follow her path, but the empty pages that follow imply that intention alone was not enough to overcome the comfort of the known. Together, Their stories form a complete picture of the choice that confronts anyone who ventures too far from the safe paths of conventional reality. The choice between the security of an eternal present and the uncertainty of a future that might contain either liberation or annihilation. 20 years after their disappearance, 35 years after they first set out on what should have been a simple week-long hike, Sarah and Michael Brennan remain missing. Their journals survive as testimony to an experience that challenges everything we think we know about the nature of reality and the boundaries of the possible. In the end, perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the true value of their story lies not in solving the mystery of what happened to them, but in preserving the questions they raised about the limits of human experience and the courage required to step beyond those limits into whatever lies waiting on the other side of certainty. The trail continues to wind through the mountains, marked by white blazes that guide hikers safely from one known point to another. But somewhere in the spaces between those blazes, in the unmapped territories that exist in the margins of the familiar world, other paths may lead to destinations that can't be found on any topographic map. And sometimes, for those who have the courage to step off the marked trail and follow those other paths wherever they may lead, the journey home requires first becoming completely and utterly lost.